In a region once ruled by conquistadors and rocked by revolutions, where generals seized power overnight and borders sparked fierce disputes, something unexpected happened. The wars stopped. Today, South America has the fewest interstate conflicts of any continent, a stunning transformation given its turbulent past, and a fact that challenges how we think about violence in our own time. How did nations with histories of coups and rivalries learn to live side by side, while other parts of the world remain locked in cycles of bloodshed? This isn't just a story of old treaties or forgotten battles. It's about geography, diplomacy, and choices by leaders that turned former battlegrounds into some of the calmest borders on Earth, and it may hold lessons for regions struggling with conflict today. Welcome to Armchair Archaeology. Stay until the end because we'll reveal an overlooked fact about South America's lasting peace, one that could change how you see conflict anywhere in the world. So grab your favorite drink and settle in, because understanding this unlikely peace might just change the way you think about borders everywhere. But before we jump into South America's ancient empires, if you're passionate about uncovering the hidden stories of our world, hit that subscribe button and join us at Armchair Archaeology. Let's explore these mysteries together. Let's rewind to a time before Europeans arrived. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, South America was already a continent alive with ambition, conquest, and shifting alliances. The Inca are remembered today for their breathtaking cities like Machu Picchu, yet they were fierce conquerors who built an empire stretching more than 4,000 kilometers, farther than the distance from New York to Los Angeles. They absorbed dozens of ethnic groups through relentless campaigns, strategic marriages, and carefully negotiated alliances. Yet the Inca were far from alone in their hunger for power. In the north, the Muisca Confederation thrived on salt and emerald trade, wielding economic might to sway neighbors, seal alliances, or threaten rivals into submission. Farther south, civilizations like Tiwanaku and Wari rose and fell in bloody contests over control of highland trade routes and fertile valleys, building complex cities whose ruins still bear silent witness to centuries of shifting dominance. Conflict wasn't simply a reaction to threats, it was a deliberate instrument of rule. Victorious armies paraded captives through grand plazas to legitimize leaders, alliances were forged or shattered on the battlefield, and prisoners were sometimes sacrificed in rituals designed to reinforce a ruler's divine mandate. These patterns of calculated violence remind us of how even today, shows of force, propaganda, or the displacement of populations remain powerful tools for states to maintain or extend control. To secure their empire, Inca rulers implemented mitmak. Entire communities were uprooted and relocated hundreds of kilometers away, fracturing local identities and spreading new languages. Mitmak was like a forced game of musical chairs, designed to break rebellious spirits by scattering communities far from home. Tens of thousands were moved at a time, a staggering feat of social engineering that foreshadow the massive refugee movements we see today when wars or environmental crises force millions to abandon their homes. This history reveals that South America was anything but naturally peaceful. Achieving lasting coexistence required breaking cycles of rivalry that had endured for centuries. When European ships finally appeared on South America's shores in the early 1500s, they didn't find an unclaimed wilderness. They encountered powerful empires with armies, cities, and complex political systems. But the Inca, Muisca, and other societies were unprepared for the new kind of warfare the Spanish and Portuguese brought. Steel weapons, cavalry charges, firearms, and the deadliest weapon of all, European diseases. Smallpox and measles spread faster than conquistadors could march, wiping out entire communities and weakening empires before battles even began. Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca in the 1530s was shockingly swift. It was made possible not only by his small band of soldiers, but also by exploiting a civil war between rival Inca claimants and forging alliances with local enemies of the empire. Resistance still flared across the continent. In Colombia, guerrilla fighters used dense jungles to mount ambushes. In southern Chile, the Mapuche fiercely defended their lands.
For more than 300 years, the Mapuche resisted Spanish and later Chilean invasions, a struggle so prolonged it became one of the longest indigenous resistances in world history. This tenacity challenges the myth of inevitable European domination, revealing how indigenous strategies of adaptation and resistance slowed conquest even as colonial powers advanced. Meanwhile, Spain and Portugal entrenched their rule with stone fortresses, divided land through encomienda systems that enslaved indigenous populations under the guise of tribute, and cultivated rivalries between tribes to keep them from uniting. By the late 1500s, sprawling viceroyalties were established, setting up colonial administrations that would endure for centuries. This violent transformation didn't just topple ancient dynasties, it created new elites loyal to European crowns and laid the groundwork for disputes and alliances that would shape South America's borders long after the conquistadors were gone. Even before conquistadors finished subduing South America, European powers were already arguing over how to divide it. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, drawing an imaginary line down the Atlantic that granted Portugal a narrow slice of the continent in the east, what would become Brazil, while the rest fell under Spanish control. But as explorers pushed inland, they discovered sprawling river networks, impassable mountains, and powerful indigenous nations that made enforcing this simple line impossible. Colonial officials and settlers ignored the treaty whenever convenient, leading to constant disputes as both empires vied for territory deep inside the continent. Spain tried to control the chaos by reorganizing its territories into viceroyalties, like Peru and New Granada, to centralize administration and better collect wealth. Meanwhile, Portuguese settlers quietly expanded beyond their original claims, pushing into the Amazon in search of gold, slaves, and land. This expansion created simmering tensions that flared repeatedly along the frontier, forcing new negotiations and alliances with local peoples. The pivotal moment came with the 1750 Treaty of Madrid, which abandoned the old Atlantic line in favor of uti possidetis, a Latin term meaning whoever occupies land keeps it, which meant borders would follow actual settlements instead of royal decrees. Imagine trying to enforce borders in an era without GPS or even accurate maps. The result was chaos and creative negotiation. This principle became the hidden blueprint for the region's modern frontiers. When independence arrived, new nations largely adopted colonial boundaries, dramatically reducing later border disputes. Unlike Africa or the Middle East, where colonial lines drawn by outsiders in the 20th century sparked endless wars, South America's borders had been negotiated on the ground centuries earlier. By the late 1700s, the map of Spanish and Portuguese possessions already hinted at today's nations, setting up a surprisingly stable geopolitical puzzle, one that would both unite and divide the continent in the wars to come. By the way, if you're intrigued by how ancient treaties and borders still shape our world today, you'll love our ebook, Secrets of the Ancient World. It uncovers forgotten technologies, mysterious civilizations, and strange turning points that changed history. Check it out. The link's in the pinned comment below.
As the 19th century began, the old colonial order of South America stood on shaky ground. Enlightenment ideas of liberty, combined with frustration over heavy taxation and the chaos of Napoleonic wars in Europe, ignited rebellions across the continent. Leaders like Simón Bolívar, the liberator from Venezuela, and José de San Martín from Argentina, organized sprawling armies of Creoles, indigenous allies, and freed slaves to challenge Spanish rule. These wars weren't quick uprisings. They were sprawling, bloody campaigns that raged from the Caribbean to the southern Andes, transforming South America into one of the most violent theaters of revolution in world history. Battles like Boyacá in Colombia, Ayacucho in Peru, and Maipú in Chile weren't just clashes of armies. They were decisive moments that shattered Spanish authority. Yet, far from uniting the continent, independence wars often set regions against each other. Former comrades in arms turned rivals overnight, as caudillos, local strongmen, fought for control over new nations. In Gran Colombia,
Bolivar's dream of a unified republic disintegrated as Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador split apart amid bitter conflicts. In the Rio de la Plata region, Argentina and Uruguay descended into decades of civil wars and shifting alliances. The cost of these wars was staggering. Historians estimate that in some regions, like what is now Colombia and Venezuela, up to a quarter of the population perished through battle, famine, or disease, levels of devastation that rivaled Europe's 30 Years' War. Yet these shared sacrifices forged new identities and ambitions, planting the seeds of independent nations. But independence also inherited old colonial borders, setting up both the foundation for peaceful coexistence and the roots of future disputes that would echo through the coming century. But what came after these wars would test the young republics like never before. Even after the wars for independence ended, South America's new nations were far from peaceful. The 19th century was marked by bitter disputes as states jockeyed for control of rivers, trade routes, and mineral-rich lands, each eager to secure or expand territory left vague by colonial borders. These weren't border skirmishes, but massive wars that redrew the continent's map and scarred generations. But some rivalries exploded into wars so catastrophic they would leave scars lasting generations. The War of the Triple Alliance, 1864 to 1870, stands as the deadliest interstate conflict in Latin American history. Paraguay, under dictator Francisco Solano López, fought simultaneously against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in a war sparked by ambitions over river trade and territorial claims. By the war's end, Paraguay's population was reduced by more than half, with some estimates suggesting up to 70% of men killed. A staggering loss that reshaped the country for decades and terrified neighboring governments into avoiding similar conflicts. This devastation became a cautionary tale, reminding leaders that total war could erase a nation entirely. Other conflicts followed. The War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1884, pitted Chile against Bolivia and Peru over the Atacama Desert's nitrate deposits, shifting borders dramatically and leaving Bolivia landlocked, a grievance that remains alive today and occasionally reignites tensions. Lesser-known wars like the Acre War saw Brazil seizing rubber-rich territory from Bolivia. Each conflict changed the political landscape and revealed how quickly disputes could spiral into continent-wide disasters. But as the century closed, memories of these catastrophic wars lingered. Leaders increasingly chose diplomacy and treaties over open conflict, realizing that the cost of total war was simply too high. This collective trauma planted early seeds for a new norm, resolving disputes without unleashing the horrors of the 19th century battlefields. Yet old rivalries still simmered, and the 20th century would show whether peace could hold. What do you think? Could the devastating 19th century wars have actually scared South American leaders into choosing peace? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your take on this turning point in history.
As the 20th century dawned, South American leaders carried the haunting memory of catastrophic 19th century wars and were determined not to repeat those mistakes. Yet old border disputes still lingered, especially between Peru and Ecuador, where tangled colonial maps and the dense Amazonian jungle left both nations claiming the same remote territories. These simmering tensions first erupted into open conflict in 1941, then again in the brief but intense Paquisha War of 1981, and once more in 1995's Cenepa War. Each time, fierce battles broke out, but both countries showed a clear reluctance to let these clashes spiral into broader wars that could drag in their neighbors. During the Cenepa War, modern helicopters and fighter jets roared above the cloud forests of the Cordillera del Condor, but battles remained confined to isolated mountain ridges far from major cities. International mediators, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the United States, stepped in almost immediately, pushing both sides toward a ceasefire that ended hostilities after just 6 weeks. A sharp contrast to the continent's past wars that often raged for years. Compare that to past wars that dragged on for years, it was a night and day difference. By 1998, Peru and Ecuador signed a final peace treaty, drawing a definitive border,
and publicly pledging lasting peace with a televised ceremony that reassured citizens across both countries. The way these late 20th century conflicts stayed contained, despite bitter grievances and modern arsenals, revealed a profound shift. Leaders increasingly recognized that large-scale invasions would only bring ruin, and disputes were better settled through negotiation. Observing how quickly these wars ended, without expanding beyond border zones, other South American nations began favoring diplomacy over force. This emerging norm helped transform a continent, once defined by conquest, into a region where even bitter disputes rarely escalate into open war. A fragile but remarkable achievement that continues into the present. So what made this transformation possible? How did a continent with a history of brutal conquests, devastating independence wars, and deep-seated rivalries transform into a place where wars between nations almost disappeared? Historians and political scientists have pointed to several key factors that together help explain this unlikely peace. Geography is often considered the first piece of the puzzle. South America's towering Andes, vast pampas, and dense Amazonian rainforest create formidable obstacles that make large-scale invasions logistically daunting and financially ruinous. Unlike Europe's open plains where armies could march across borders in days, South America's natural barriers frustrate even modern military campaigns. Yet geography alone can't explain the shift. Colonial borders, drawn centuries earlier through treaties like Madrid in 1750, gave newly independent nations surprisingly well-defined frontiers. Unlike regions where independence created endless disputes over where one country ended and another began, South America's leaders largely chose to keep these colonial boundaries. This continuity removed one of the biggest triggers of interstate war. At the same time, many nations spent the 19th and 20th centuries grappling with internal conflicts, coups, civil wars, and guerrilla insurgencies that consumed resources and attention, leaving little appetite or capacity for external wars. Global changes after World War II also played a decisive role. The growing international consensus against territorial conquest, reinforced by institutions like the United Nations and the Organization of American States, made invasions riskier politically and economically. Leaders who might have considered attacking a neighbor risked diplomatic isolation or economic sanctions. Meanwhile, new regional forums like Mercosur offered alternatives to violence by giving countries a platform to negotiate disputes. Together, these factors created a new norm. In South America, settling differences through treaties and arbitration became the expected path. A quiet revolution that set the continent apart in a world still racked by war. While South America's avoidance of wars between sovereign nations is impressive, it's a myth to imagine the continent as truly peaceful. Throughout the 20th century, nearly every country experienced waves of internal violence that left deep scars. Let's be clear, this peace didn't mean peace for everyone. Guerrilla movements like Colombia's FARC and ELN fought protracted wars against government forces, displacing millions and causing massive civilian suffering. In Peru, the Shining Path's brutal insurgency during the 1980s and 1990s unleashed bombings, assassinations, and massacres that terrorized the countryside and destabilized the government. These conflicts weren't minor uprisings. They were grinding wars that lasted decades and shaped the lives of entire generations. Meanwhile, authoritarian regimes rose across the region, often with military coups toppling elected leaders. Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and others endured periods of dictatorship during the Cold War, using kidnapping, torture, and extrajudicial killings to crush dissent. In Argentina alone, thousands were disappeared in what became known as the Dirty War, leaving families searching for loved ones decades later. These internal wars and state-sponsored terror campaigns brought suffering on a scale that rivaled open wars in other parts of the world. Yet what stands out is that despite these violent internal convulsions, South America's conflicts rarely escalated into wars between nations. Even when guerrilla groups crossed borders, governments worked to prevent localized clashes from turning into full-scale invasions. Leaders understood that dragging neighbors into internal strife risked triggering regional chaos none of them could afford. This paradox, brutal domestic violence alongside interstate peace, shows that avoiding wars between nations didn't mean societies were stable or just. It's a reminder that peace on paper can hide deep divisions, and that achieving real, lasting peace requires confronting violence within as well as between borders. If you're enjoying this journey, consider tapping the super thanks below. It's a great way to support our work so we can keep bringing you stories like this.
As South America settled into an uneasy but enduring peace between nations, the rest of the world seemed unable to break cycles of interstate war. In Europe, the first half of the 20th century saw two world wars that killed tens of millions and redrew borders with terrifying speed. Even after 1945, the continent wasn't immune. The violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s showed how quickly disputes over identity and territory could ignite into large-scale bloodshed. Meanwhile, Africa's colonial legacy left borders drawn without regard for ethnic or cultural realities. As new nations emerged, these arbitrary lines sparked wars from Nigeria's Biafran conflict to Eritrea's fight for independence, leading to decades of violence across the continent. In Asia, repeated wars over territory have defined modern history. India and Pakistan fought multiple wars over Kashmir. China and Vietnam clashed in a brutal 1979 border war, and the Korean peninsula remains frozen in a technically unresolved conflict after a devastating war in the early 1950s. The Middle East has also been shaped by wars driven by shifting alliances, religious divides, and ambitions over land, from the Arab-Israeli wars to Iraq's invasions of neighbors. These conflicts have often spilled beyond borders, dragging in superpowers and destabilizing entire regions. Against this backdrop, South America's record is striking. Since 1945, the continent has experienced only a handful of short interstate wars, each quickly contained. It might surprise you that continents often seen as more stable, like Europe or Asia, experienced far more wars between countries in the same period. This isn't because nations lacked disputes, but because a shared norm emerged that prioritized negotiation and arbitration. It's a statistic that surprises many. South America, often stereotyped as unstable, has quietly maintained a peace between countries unmatched by any other populated continent, a record that stands out even more starkly when set against the global tide of wars that continued through the 20th century. It's amazing, isn't it? A continent that once saw wars wiping out entire populations now avoids interstate wars even as internal struggles rage on. If you want to dig deeper into these paradoxes of peace and violence, our ebook, Secrets of the Ancient World, is packed with stories that challenge everything you thought you knew. Links in the pinned comment. While South America's long record of avoiding wars between nations is remarkable, its peace is not unbreakable. Emerging pressures could reignite tensions, especially as the region grapples with economic crises, environmental changes, and shifting global dynamics. Competition over natural resources, for instance, could spark new disputes. The Amazon rainforest spans multiple borders, and as it becomes more critical to global climate efforts, countries could clash over control of forests, rivers, and mineral-rich lands. Water scarcity looms as a growing risk too. As glaciers feeding rivers in the Andes shrink, countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Chile could find themselves in conflict over vital water supplies. Migration poses another potential flashpoint. Venezuela's ongoing economic collapse has driven millions to flee into neighboring Colombia, Brazil, and beyond, overwhelming local services and fueling resentment. If future political or climate crises push even more people across borders, the strain could challenge the continent's habit of peaceful coexistence. Yet there are also powerful reasons to hope the peace will hold. Regional organizations like Mercosur and UNASUR, while imperfect, provide forums for dialogue that simply didn't exist during the continent's war-torn past. In recent years, countries have increasingly turned to the International Court of Justice to settle border disagreements, as seen in the maritime dispute between Chile and Bolivia. Public ceremonies celebrating peace treaties like those between Peru and Ecuador have created shared moments of reconciliation that reinforce norms against war. These trends suggest South America's leaders understand the heavy price of conflict and remain committed to avoiding it. Whether that commitment will survive rising pressures may define the continent's next century and offer lessons for a world still searching for ways to keep old rivalries from turning into new wars.
After centuries of conquest, revolution, and devastating wars, South America did something few thought possible. Remember the surprising fact we promised at the start? Here it is. Since 1945, South America has had fewer interstate wars than any other inhabited continent, even fewer than Australia, which only has one country. This remarkable record defies common beliefs about regions destined for conflict and shows how geography, colonial-era borders, and norms of negotiation combined to build an enduring peace among nations that once seemed doomed to endless rivalry. Yet this peace remains fragile. Climate change, resource competition, and mass migrations could still test it in the coming decades. South America's story reminds us that peace isn't just the absence of war, it's a choice renewed by each generation, shaped by leaders and citizens willing to learn from the past. And while internal struggles remain, the continent proves that even a region with a violent history can break cycles of revenge if it commits to settling disputes without armies. This is where we turn it over to you. So, what do you think the rest of the world can learn from South America's remarkable record of peace between nations? Could similar lessons help regions still trapped in conflict today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching Armchair Archaeology, where we uncover the mysteries of the past to better understand the world we live in today. Until our next video, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep your curiosity alive, because history has more to teach us than we ever imagined.